In just about any pop culture conversation, it is difficult to bring up fantasy without also mentioning science fiction, or sci-fi, which is often viewed as a second half to a whole. In almost every single video I've made so far covering fantasy, there will consistently be those in the comments that will debate whether or not certain projects qualify more as sci-fi or fantasy, and a term that will often be thrown around is space fantasy, which for many of us is a sort of gray area between the two. To help alleviate some of the confusion, I thought I'd spend some time going over the genre definitions, and help to put a label on what counts as what. As always with these sort of discussions, there's a lot of personal opinion involved, and not everyone is going to share the same ideas on what exactly counts as space fantasy. So be sure to let me know in the comments what you think of the space fantasy genre as a whole, and be sure to mention any other works you feel I should have included. Before we even start talking about space fantasy, I think it's first important to lay out what the definition of science fiction even is. The genre itself focuses on telling stories that feature different levels of science or technology. And while it isn't always the case, they are commonly set in a futuristic setting. One of the tricky aspects in nailing down a direct definition comes from the fact that a lot of authors tend to be the own judge on whether or not their works count as science fiction or fantasy. For me, however, where science fiction and space fantasy begin to diverge is within a few of these following elements. Firstly, as obvious as it may sound, space fantasy is always set in space, and regardless of whether or not the story spends 90% of the time on one planet, space travel needs to be a known factor within the world. Secondly, space fantasy is set in an original universe, outside the bounds of our solar system, as separating the story from the bounds of reality can allow for space fantasy to introduce magical elements. Space fantasy is also sometimes referred to as science fantasy, and the interchangeability between the two is mostly semantic. This term first came into existence in the early 20th century when authors like L. Ron Hubbard, Robert A. Heinlein, and Fletcher Pratt began publishing their own spins on a mix between science fiction and fantasy in American pulp magazines. As far as some of the earliest examples of on-screen space fantasy, some people often cite Star Trek as a good example, and I personally have conflicting opinions on that. As I stated earlier, a big parameter for me to classify something as space fantasy depends on whether or not it takes place in its own universe, and Star Trek is set in the far distant future of our own universe. However, some often credit the more mystical aspects of Star Trek, for example, the character Q, as reasons why it should count as space fantasy over science fiction. I just think for me personally, Star Trek and Ender's Game have always served as the pinnacle of science fiction, so I struggle with the classification. But let me know what you think. While I am personally a much bigger fan of fantasy than I am sci-fi, space fantasy includes a lot of examples that I love, and its direct influence of more magical or whimsical elements adds to that special flair that really causes it to stand out for me. There is also a certain sense of freedom that comes when a story is set outside the bounds and rules of our own universe. This feeds into my opinions on fantasy as a whole, where I often prefer stories that have in-depth lore and vast world building. One of the aspects I do enjoy about science fiction and space fantasy is the tendency to focus on stories surrounding the potential consequences of scientific, technologic, or social advancements. Those types of stories almost always have a deeper message that can range from blatant to subtle, but regardless, they can provide an interesting setting for philosophical debate. Though the unfortunate side effect to that is it can often cause a lot of sci-fi projects to become incredibly dreary when you stop to think about them. So we've already talked a little bit about Star Trek, and I don't want to spend too much time rehashing what's already been said, but I just want to put it out there that while I haven't watched a ton of the series myself, I am a fan of it and think it's a really fun franchise. I'll include it in my list of examples just due to the amount of back and forth I've seen over it, but I personally think it should be more strongly in the science fiction category. Now, to tackle the biggest example, most of you have probably already guessed this, but Star Wars is by far the most popular space fantasy series. George Lucas has technically stated that Star Wars is a fantasy and space opera, but space fantasy still works to encompass all of that. Star Wars fits nicely within the space fantasy category, mainly based on its inclusion of the Jedi and the Sith, and the utilization of the magic system they wield known as the Force. In many ways, the science aspect of Star Wars often takes a back seat, and at least for the Skywalker saga, it's never the driving force of the story. Sure, you have plot elements like the Death Star and the Confederacy's droid army, but even those serve more as backdrops to the true essence of the story, which is exploring the journey of a particular character learning to train with the Force, wield a lightsaber, and defeat the evil plaguing the galaxy. Whether it's Anakin, Luke, or Rey, their tutelage with the Force is always at the heart of the story. And only projects like Rogue One, and especially Andor, would I truly consider to be more science fiction. Another space fantasy epic is Dune, and fun fact, assuming everything goes according to schedule, this video is actually going to come out on the same weekend that Dune Part 2 releases in theaters. Not a paid promotion, just a fun fact. I wish it was paid. Wouldn't that be cool? Yet again, similar to Star Wars, Dune features many classic sci-fi elements, but distinguishes itself with a unique and creative universe with its own distinct set of rules. And the Bene Gesserit, which are some sort of magic cult that bend and shape the universe in accordance with their own plans, definitely add that fantastical element of prophecy and magical powers. Also, I know this isn't a huge fantasy exclusive element, but I just love how in Dune they all use swords instead of guns, and actually have it built into the lore that guns are ineffective against their shield technology. But that's just a personal thing for me. I've always preferred sword and shields over guns and grenades. Moving on to something more modern, Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere makes my list for space fantasy based mostly on some technical terminology. Now, if you've read any of the major series within The Cosmere, mainly Mistborn and the Stormlight Archives, you're probably thinking those stories aren't space fantasy at all, they're just pure high fantasy. And you are correct, The Cosmere is not space fantasy. Yet, due to the nature of the way that Sanderson's worlds work, and the fact that he is very involved in speculative discussion, be it through podcasts or fan events, we know that the stories are all set within the same dwarf galaxy. And even though the current novels are all wholly based on singular planets, Sanderson has plans for telling stories set on those same worlds, but set far into the distant future, in a time where space travel is known and an accessible part of the story. So yes, this one is a little tricky, but put a pin in it, because 15 or 20 years from now, there's going to be some really good space fantasy stories coming out of the Cosmere. Lastly, I would just like to briefly touch on a couple examples that qualify to varying degrees, mainly StarCraft, Battlestar Galactica, and Warhammer 40,000. Just to get it out of the way, I do want to painfully admit that I've spent almost no time in the Warhammer universe, be it the base edition or 40k. So I am sorry that I don't have a lot to say, but in the research I did for this video, looking into it provided some nice evidence that it fits nicely within space fantasy. And since it's one of the most beloved franchises of all time, I knew I couldn't make this video without mentioning it. I do promise that one day I will get around to exploring it more in depth. StarCraft, on the other hand, I have played, but I am ashamed to admit that I never fully dived into the story sections of the campaign, and mainly just resorted to playing online with my friends. This runs into the same issues as Star Trek, where it's technically set in the distant future of our galaxy, but due to some of the more mystical elements of the world, and the fact that there are some people who don't eliminate a project from space fantasy based solely on whether or not it exists in our universe or another, I think I can still count it for space fantasy. But speaking of being set in our universe, Battlestar Galactica is the last one I wanted to bring up, which does meet a lot of those same roadblocks, but right off the first episode, it's kind of unclear on whether or not it really is set in our universe or not. And without getting too much into spoilers, there are some mystical elements of this series that come into play towards the final seasons. Regardless, all of these aforementioned movies, books, and shows are excellent in their own right and are well worth checking out. It does seem like the more technologically advanced our world becomes, the more there grows a desire for our entertainment to focus on telling stories from different imagined futures we might inherit. Some might say these projects are so popular right now because we live in a great age of speculation, as technology is quickly moving at an unprecedented rate, and no one can safely say what the world will actually look like 40 years from now. It can be exciting to look towards the future, but it can also be terrifying, and many of these projects often can't resist playing to our fears and exploring some of the grim and dark realities that might unfold. On an existential level, this can be quite a lot to take in, and is often why I prefer and take more comfort in fantasy shows that are more detached from the problems and concerns I have with our natural world. That is not to say I don't enjoy sci-fi or those types of movies. In fact, one of my favorite projects from last year was The Creator, which was a movie I originally just went to see because I found out they shot it with the same camera I was using at my job at the time, but putting that aside, I found myself really enjoying it, and I have nothing against people who prefer those genres to any other. For me, space fantasy fills that same box that medieval fantasy does, and provides a story that is easy to immerse yourself in and forget about the problems of the world for a while. I do think that it is important to explore projects that cover heavy topics from our world, and it is even more important to take away the messages and learn to expand your worldview and overall level of acceptance. But there's also nothing wrong with wanting to detach for a while. And if you're a fan of grand, sweeping adventures that traverse the very stars themselves, then give space fantasy a try, and I guarantee you'll find stories that extend beyond the bounds of what you ever thought possible.